very quickly Unit 3 about motivation. And all I'm going to do here is use 3 quick charts. Still the same basic theme of inequality. Now, you have different themes, different issues that you are, many of you, dealing with. But I want to use these charts because they have to do, and in my experience, have a lot to do with motivating people. All right. So this is, according to most Americans, here is the ideal distribution of wealth. In other words, when you ask most Americans, something like 65, 70% of Americans, they will say the top 20% ought to have about this much of the nation's wealth, ideally. The second ought to have that much, and the middle ought to have this much, and the bottom ought to have this much. This is what most Americans think is a kind of equitable allocation of the nation's wealth, according to many surveys. This is what most people think the actual distribution is. So they already have in their heads a kind of dissonance between what they think is the ideal and what they believe is the actual. Now, what I want to get at, I'm going to show you a third. What I want to get at is every time there's a dissonance between what people believe is the ideal and what they think is the actual, that cognitive dissonance is the stuff out of which social movements and social change always emerges. If you can identify that divergence between the ideal and the reality, or belief about the reality, that's powerful. But I want to show you, this is what people think the actual distribution of wealth is. This is the real distribution of wealth. So the real distribution is so much more skewed than what people think is the actual, which itself is so much more skewed than what people think is the ideal. So what you have just here in 3 charts, and I'm not suggesting that you use charts. I'm just suggesting that in terms of motivation, look for the opportunities over and over again to contrast what people think is the real, what they believe is the ideal, and what actually is the real. Because almost everybody carries around in their heads a sense of what the social ideal should be. No matter what your issues are, everybody carries around in their heads a sense of what the gap likely is. But often they don't know the reality. In my experience, well, just to give you one personal experience, in 1996, Republicans ran both the House and the Senate, and I said to Bill Clinton, as Labor Secretary, don't you think it's about time we raised the minimum wage? It hadn't been raised in years. And Bill Clinton, President Clinton, said back to me, no way we're going to raise the minimum wage. The Republicans have both houses of Congress. And I had an instinct that there was a great deal of cognitive dissonance going on in terms of what people understood about the minimum wage and what they thought that the ideal ought to be and really what the reality was. And so we did a quick and dirty little survey, and it showed that 85% of Americans thought that the minimum wage should be raised. In other words, 85% of Americans, in terms of their view of the ideal versus their view of the reality, they thought already, before we even tried to sell it, before we even had one discussion with Republicans, 85% of Americans thought the minimum wage should be raised. Most people had no idea that it had not been raised in so many years, that the real value of the minimum wage had actually declined substantially from where it was the last time it was raised. So when we went out and started to talk to people, Republicans, members of the House, senators, and showed those positions, the equivalent of these, a lot of people said, that's amazing. And 85% of Americans want it raised already, and they don't even know how much it's deteriorated. Well, to make a very long story short, with a Republican Senate and a Republican House, we raised the minimum wage. And we did it a lot and substantially on the basis of this cognitive dissonance. So takeaways here: discover their ideals. Number two, listen to their factual assumptions about what the reality is. Number three, reveal gaps between the reality and the ideals. And number four, use this cognitive dissonance to open up the discussion to real possibilities for change.